Hi, I'm Kendall Storey, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the 2020 Brooklyn Book Festival. We're here today with authors Peter Kispert, Marie-Helene Bertino, Sarah Gerard, and Deesha Philyaw. Before we begin, I just want to let you know that the books by our authors in the program can be purchased in the link below. And I'll just quickly introduce our panelists. So Marie-Helene Bertino is the author of the novels Parakeet and 2 a.m. at the Cat's Pajamas, as well as the collection Safe as Houses. And she was the 2017 Frank O'Connor International Short Story Fellow in Cork, Ireland. Peter Kispert is the author of the recent story collection I Know You Know Who I Am. His fiction and nonfiction has appeared or is forthcoming in GQ, Esquire, Playboy, Electric Literature's Recommended Reading, Slice, and elsewhere. Sarah Gerard is the author of the essay collection Sunshine State and the novel Binary Star, which was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Art Seidenbaum Award for First Fiction. True Love is her newest novel. Deesha Philyaw's debut story collection, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, which was just nominated for the National Book Award for Fiction, congratulations, focuses on Black women, sex, and the Black church. Deesha is also the co-author of Co-Parenting 101, Helping Your Kids Thrive in Two Households After Divorce, written in collaboration with her ex-husband. Welcome, everyone. We're here to talk about how humor functions in literature, and specifically in your own works of fiction. So I'll just start out by asking a question for all of you to answer, which is, when you set out to write, how important is it to you that your humor be incorporated into the work? Is it something that comes naturally to you, or is it something that you consciously insert?
I think it has to be organic. I don't think I've ever thought to myself like, okay, grief, but make it funny, but sometimes the story kind of lends itself to that. And often for me, the humor might pop up and I really kind of rely on beta readers to let me know if it's kind of working or not. And if it feels organic, I don't want it to feel forced. But I do write about sort of sad things, or I write about sex, and sometimes there's humor and sometimes there's not. And I think it just kind of reflects our human experience, that even in the midst of something really, really awful, you might have a very irreverent thought, and then sometimes you don't, and so it's a little hit or miss.
Yeah, for me, it's both. I knew at the outset that the narrator, that her voice was very particular. She's a millennial, or younger, actually. She's in her early 20s, and it's 2014 when the book opens, so I don't know what generation that makes her, Gen Z, I guess. But, I was thinking a lot about concision and where she would have found her voice, most likely on social media, Twitter. It's very quippy. There are these sort of snap judgments, and she's very defensive. But I also knew that she is not a likable character necessarily. So in order to win over the reader, I knew that I had to make her funny, to entice them to continue reading even when she's doing very bad things. So yeah, so for me, it's a bit of both. It was, I need to find enjoyment in the act of writing. And I also have to help the reader find enjoyment in this story too, even when bad things are happening to her and to other people in the book. There's a lot of pain in the book too, which I think is inextricable from the humor.
Absolutely. I agree with what Sarah and Deesha have said, and I'm somewhere in between. Parakeet is a story about an injured, traumatized, irreverent bride on the eve of her wedding day who is visited by this bird who is her grandmother, warning her, don't do it. You've lost track of yourself. And since this is my third book, I have realized now that the humor creeps in whether I am intending it to or not, because I suppose that's just the way I am expressing what I want to say about how absurd life can be, and how the juxtaposition of things that most humans take very seriously against things that are utterly ridiculous can butt up against each other in a way that creates this friction that people seem to find funny, especially when you read it out loud and you think that I have a short story called Exit Zero, which I thought was the most serious thing I had ever written, serious and sad, and I read it out loud and people laughed. And that taught me a lot about what I think is funny and what readers think is funny.
That's so interesting. I got, a similar response to some readers of my stories, saying that they found them very funny. And I guess, I don't know if it's fair to say that I intended them to be very serious, but it wasn't my intention, for them to be somehow like slapstick or even to elicit laughter. And it made me think a lot about how humor functions in my work, particularly with characters' sarcasm and the irony that I sometimes impose. The collection, for those who aren't familiar, is full of a lot of deceitful gay men in particular. And so I think that the humor kind of bubbles up or has something to do with their awareness of their own circumstance, even though they are incredibly delusional much of the time. And then sort of thinking about the narrative irony and a lot of the sort of karmic punch that I deal to these men. One in particular, there's a man who lies to his partner about having been a professional swimmer in order to seem more athletic. One day, years into this sort of tended to lie, is with his partner picnicking near a lake, goes out and saves a drowning boy. And while he's doing so, his partner reveals to a reporter on the beach that he was once a professional swimmer. And so, later on in the story, while this lie is sort of eating away at him, he finds himself on a boat with the parents of the boy he saved and kind of can't help but jumping into the water. Now, when I wrote that, I thought it was working on the level of subtext, which is ridiculous to think of now. That's actually what makes me laugh. But yeah, I don't know, there's something funny about that, about karma kind of coming in and kind of knocking these characters who thought, if only I can be aware of everything, then I can control it, flat.
Yeah, it's funny, interesting hearing each of you speak about the particular humor in each of your books. I mean, it reminds me that each of your books is very funny, but of course funny is so subjective, isn't it? I mean, funny can be ironic, it can be sardonic, droll, dry, self-deprecating, it can be slapstick. But what struck me as I was reading all of your recent books is that you're all funny in completely different ways from one another. And I wonder, is the way that you're funny on the page different from the way that you're funny in real life?
I think for me, it's similar. I always joke that I didn't develop a sense of humor until I got divorced the first time. I don't know what was unlocked, but I think that, that my humor is really rooted in my background, and which is from the South and coming from a long line, particularly of women, and spending a lot of time with older Black women, and sort of the humor and the music and their voices, which I'm glad that I inherited, even though it was sort of repressed there for a while, but now it's back. And so those are the women who are in my stories. And so it's their humor that can be, really biting. I'm thinking about my story, Dear Sister, and there's an older woman who's trying to remember a girl, one of the sisters that she met, and she's like, there was another one of you, there was another sister, the fat one. And the girl goes, oh no, I wasn't fat, I was just pregnant. She's like, no, I know when you were pregnant, no, that time you were fat. And like, that's really how, growing up in the South, like people were really blunt, and it could be hurtful, but it was just, and then they're on to the next thing. And so that just sort of like what do I do with this? So it's like this heaviness, that ouch, and then, but you're on to the next thing. And like, is it really funny? Is it really okay to laugh at that? Does it make it okay because she's old? And as you know, one of my characters observed, like, old people say things to you like that because you can't shake the shit out of them, you know, stuff like that. And so that's, you know, it's looking back at my childhood and the voices of those women, and you know, and they didn't always think they were funny, you know, and then there's that sort of, as the title of this this conversation, laughing through tears, because there were a lot of things that were said to us as kids that at the time it was hurtful. You know, there were lots of comments on your body and things like that. Hygiene, you know, we were told, like, as kids, you came in from outside, you smell like billy goats. That was, which is hilarious now, but you know, when you're a self-conscious kid, not so much. So for me, a lot of it is rooted in my my upbringing and my culture.
I don't know that I can even say that I'm funny in real life. I feel like that's a better question for those people who have to deal with me in my real life. I will say that an element of humor that I find to be very funny in real life that will probably never make it onto the page is funny dancing. If someone is doing a funny dance, it is endlessly hysterical to me, and I don't know that I would be able to translate that to the page. And on the page, it's normally the ridiculous that makes me laugh. Like, I'm thinking of, like Peter was saying, the ridiculous situations, the karmic punch that you said. I'm thinking of the last novel that made me laugh so hard. And because the timing and the concision is so expert, I'm able to read it over and over again and still laugh because the delivery is perfect, is Andrew Sean Greer's Less, the novel Less. I feel like something can be funny. I know this is like a trope, a well-known thing about humor. Something can be funny once and you laugh at it, but if it's funny over and over again, it's because the delivery was perfect. And that's a novel that I can read over and over again, and I still laugh at some of the setups he has, and the recurring jokes. It's a book that has its own private jokes with itself, so it has memory. It keeps referring to itself, and I definitely hope to have that in my style too. Maybe not in my life, but on the page.
I hope that I'm funny in real life. I think that I'm funny in real life, but the way that my narrator, the way that Nina is funny in True Love is different from me insofar as she is much meaner than I am. And I think actually there are things that she jokes about in the book that I absolutely wouldn't joke about in real life, and that I think are quite harsh and reflect poorly on her, and that's intentional. And yeah, so we're funny in different ways. I think that I'm a much more sensitive person than Nina is, and I try to be much more empathetic to the people in my midst than Nina is. But another thing that's funny is that, well, funny and not funny, is that I recently learned that my great-grandfather was a writer, and there are so many things that I don't know about my family for reasons that are not funny, but this was one that I found kind of humorous. And he actually wrote a book about humor, and it's called What's Funny and Why, I never knew about this until about 2 weeks ago. But he says, and I guess this is, yeah, I mean, he says that things are funny for two reasons and maybe more, but I can't remember the other ones. But one is that they're very true, and the other is that we know they're not true. So in either case, it's a matter of like recognition, it's recognizing, it's our ability to recognize the difference in the moment, which I think speaks to what you said about delivery maybe. But something else that I learned from his book is that things that were funny in 1939 oftentimes are really not funny anymore. So I think there's something very timely about humor also, which I was thinking about a lot in True Love, being a satire. It was like kind of something else that my great-grandfather Milton Wright said, is that we love, it was kind of about punching up, you know, is that like we love seeing people get what they deserve, I guess, and feeling as if we're superior to somebody who previously was thought to be superior to us, you know. So writing a social satire, I guess, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I kind of lost train of my thought, but you know what I mean. Yeah.
Great. I think that's extraordinary that you just discovered that about your grandfather.
Yeah.
I love that about, you know, that we think something's either funny because it's true or because it's not true. And it made me think of your work, Peter, because your collection is so much about deception. And I wonder if you see any connection between deception and humor in your work. And, you know, it seems to me that humor often works by, you know, confounding our expectations, and deception kind of works by exploiting them. And I don't know if you find that to be true in moments in your stories, but you could speak to that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting parallel. I haven't thought of it quite like that before, but I was thinking while all of you you're so beautifully speaking about your work, about the anxiety of the liar, and how there's this sort of like humor to overthinking, like asking yourself way too many questions, or like presuming like a reality that does not exist, and then like driving at like 90 miles an hour through it. Like it's just it's really rich terrain for me, partly because I'm able to in a way it feels like too versatile or unfair to have these premises, because you can do so much with them, like these sort of catalyzing lies. So yeah, I don't know, I guess, yeah, I don't know. I guess that's all I want to say. But yeah, I don't know. I think also the idea of, you know, looking at stories, this isn't revolutionary by any means, but like as sort of like, you know, setting up and delivering, and jokes having that same sort of structure, and being able to recognize and exploit the bendability of stakes and that sort of thing. But yeah, I think, you know, the men in my stories in particular are curmudgeons and very unhappy, and find themselves sort of obsessing over questions of like superiority and masculinity and their own loneliness, which feels like kind of the worst secret in the world. So I don't know, there's something almost ridiculous about that, because the truth is that they aren't. So yeah.
Yeah, what seems to keep springing up with all of you is this, you know, I mean, obviously this panel is about humor as a means to survival, right? And there's an idea that humor springs from a place of necessity, of this need to kind of mask the darker side of life. And, you know, Deesha, you were saying that you didn't develop a sense of humor until this kind of difficult, traumatic moment of your life. And so, yeah, I wonder, do you agree about that, about the way that humor functions, you know, as a mask, or do you think that it serves other functions, you know, something we use to celebrate or to make the reader feel comfortable and relaxed? I know that a couple of you mentioned enticing the reader.
Mm-hmm. I think it provides comfort, and I don't know that, you know, unless we're being intentional about it as a device in our writing, but I think, again, it can emerge just organically if we see the ways that, you know, humor just sort of springs forth in, you know, our everyday lives. And so I don't know if it's so much something, again, that we're doing for the reader as something that, you know, we do for ourselves and for each other, in as a way of providing comfort. When I think mask, I think of like obscuring or sort of diminishing, or whereas I think humor really sort of drives something home. And it's almost like pulling off the mask, pulling off those, you know, the things that obscure, and it lays things bare. And then, you know, in that moment, we can see all of it, including the comical parts of it. And maybe, you know, in time, you know, something where we say, oh, well, we can look back at it now and laugh, you know, that maybe not in the moment. And I think that's the beauty of, you know, sort of writing whether it's fiction or nonfiction, things that, you know, based on things that have happened, you know, in the past, that through this other lens, you know, through with some distance, with some time, that, you know, we can sort of see the humor in it, and, you know, and find some comfort in something that might have been at the moment just, you know, almost unbearable.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And Deesha, I don't know if you have a little section that you want to read. I have a little section of yours.
You go for it, because I started doing the self-doubt thing, which is like, well, I think that part is funny, but do I need more context? So if you've got something chosen, I'd love to hear it.
Sure, I'll read from this hilarious little paragraph that I love in The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, which comes toward the end of the final story, when Eddie Leverett comes. Unfortunately, the zeal of the newly converted is bewildering to the children of the newly converted. One Saturday night, you've got every blanket in the house draped over your head to drown out the sound of your mother's headboard banging against the bedroom wall as she hollers her soon-to-be ex-best friend's husband's name. And the next Saturday night, she's snatching the softened deck of playing cards out of your hands because games of chance are from the devil. Much of the humor in your collection seems to come from, you know, acknowledging the contradictions within this community that so values, you know, church and religion and conventions. But then so much of the pain and darkness of the collection come from that same place, that same acknowledgement. So yeah, and I think that's true for other people on this panel as well, but I'll let them speak to that. Or Deesha, if you have anything more to say.
I mean, I think, you know, I'm thinking about that passage, and that's not one I would have chosen, because I'm thinking about it from the perspective of the children, you know, and then specifically the daughter. You know, nobody wants to think about their parents having sex. And so just the horror of that. But maybe as you get older, you know, like when you're 50, you might be able to find a little humor in it. But, you know, so to us, because it's somebody else talking about their parents, it's not us thinking about our own parents, you know, it's funny. But it's, you know, the church, I think, is ripe for that kind of duality, where there is, you know, there's all this hypocrisy and this repression, but then you get these larger than life characters as well. I think of how many times in films like that, or Eddie Murphy films or Richard Pryor films, where they play, you know, Black pastor characters, and there's all this humor around the performance of religion in the Black church, and the pastors being these men who are, you know, supposed to be men of God, but they're also, you know, scoundrels. And so we laugh at that, but then we know on the other side of that, there's a lot of pain. There's, you know, ruined lives. We know there are double standards. Like, there are things that the pastors are doing, but then it's the women they're doing them with that get vilified. That's not funny. But, you know, all of these things kind of coexist.
Let's see. Well, I'll just pivot slightly to ask everyone if there are particular writers, and I could guess for many of you, but I'll let you speak to yourselves, who've influenced your work, who you consider to be funny, or is the humor in your book influenced by people in your life? But I would love to hear some of your literary influences. I know, Marie-Helene, you've spoken about this a tiny bit.
Yeah, I am definitely influenced most by the people in my life. I grew up in Philadelphia, descended from immigrants who had nothing at all, and thought that was really funny. Like, we joked about things that were very, very dark all the time. And our humor sprung from traumatic events normally. And so I think that taught me at an early age to work against expectations. And I think that's how my humor and the supernatural elements in my work, in that, you know, you have the expectation of, like Deesha was mentioning, the church and what a member of the church would look like, and you work against that expectation, and it can be very funny, but it points to something really sad. Just as one example of my work, but I think it's all over my work, is Parakeet is a story about a wedding, but I'm presenting it as a traumatic event. Divorce is funny. Weddings can be traumatic. A grandmother can come to warn her granddaughter and curse and be irreverent and work against the expectation of what you think a grandmother, should and would be. And in that way, it's my way of resisting what I've been told my whole life things are supposed to look like, things are supposed to be. A woman is supposed to look like this and act like this, and that's ridiculous in so many ways. And so anytime, in fact, being a funny woman or a woman who tries for the joke, I'll say, has separated me a lot in academia, in all sorts of societal gatherings, because I didn't kind of stay in the box I was supposed to stay in. And so it's always there. And I think I said earlier that it comes out organically. That's in the creative discovery process. In revision, it's very much a knob that I calibrate. And so while I had to give myself permission to be funny in the first place, or to try to be funny in so-called literary serious fiction, I also dial it back to serve the story, or dial it up to serve the story. There's only been one time that I gave myself permission to be as funny as I possibly could, to make myself laugh. And that was an old short story, and then the next novel that I'm working on now. Just because, sometimes you just have to have as much fun as you can and go for the joke that makes you laugh. And so if you're having fun, hopefully the reader will too.
Absolutely. And I connected with what you were saying about, how gendered it can be sometimes, and how, how this kind of separated you, this humor separated you from others in these communities. I think it would be interesting to talk a little bit about how humor can be gendered. Is there a way in which women writers are supposed to be funny or aren't supposed to be funny? What's been your experience, or others on this panel?
Well, I mean, I think Alyssa Nutting is very, very funny, and her books, I think, are I was thinking of her book, Tampa, specifically a lot while I was writing this one, because I guess of the taboo, I mean, my book is about a woman who cheats on every partner, something that, and is unapologetic about it, and goes to extreme lengths to hide that fact, often to the point of absurdity, which I found really funny, personally. But I think just kind of thinking of my book as being in that lineage gave me a sense of permission, that I can write a book about a woman doing bad things, doing things that I think society frowns upon. But I was also thinking about The Days of Abandonment, a book that is so melodramatic in a way that I really relate to. Like, I love that kind of melodrama. And I think everybody in my book also is just melodramatic, and often wielding their trauma for either like social points, or like one-upping somebody in an argument, kind of wielding that power in a way that would be immoral, I think. So, but I don't know, but I think emotional absurdity is funny to me sometimes, if that makes sense.
Can I go back to something I believe you said, Kendall, I believe you mentioned, about humor being something that, like, what the relationship is between humor and the reader? Like, Sarah, you said it, like enticing the reader and making an unlikable character likable. I was thinking, like, in my own life, and I'd love to hear what y'all have to say about this. Humor is a way that I try to make other people feel comfortable. It's like manners. Mm-hmm. To me, it means to make people feel comfortable in a room with me. And I notice that I feel most comfortable when I realize that a new person I'm meeting is funny, or at least like will laugh. You don't have to be funny, but if you're a good laugher, even better sometimes. And so it's very much, but with a reader, I'm not trying to make a reader comfortable. In many ways, I'm trying to make a reader feel uncomfortable. Be aware of the fact that they are reading a book and they are implicated in that. So if they laugh at the bride's trauma, they are very much taking part in that trauma. Does that make sense? I'd love to hear what you all have to say about that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think sometimes humor in my book happens when there's a need for a pressure release, like something, there's a particular scene that's like so cringeworthy, you have to laugh, you know? So I'm definitely writing into that work, you know, writing into the discomfort, and, you know, it gets very over the top at times, so that you just have to laugh at it, you know? Yeah. Yeah, I would love to hear what everyone else has to say about that.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think about humor as a way of, it's a way to sort of calculate a reader's complicity in the story and investment, and kind of being able to use that to make readers feel what you want to feel. Sometimes when I'm making a joke on the page or trying to be humorous in some way, I feel more aware in a way of what I'm doing than at other moments. There's like a certain, not necessarily like injection of levity, but like a certain energy that I feel the story needs at that point. And I notice it especially, it's sort of like ending scenes or coming out of something as like, especially sort of like in just kind of like suturing like time on the page. But I guess, yeah, separately, what I kept thinking about, you know, especially as a part of this conversation about humor having a kind of one-one with trauma, you know, sort of that, but with shame, and the shame of being a queer man who is out of the closet. Like, I'm not interested personally or as a writer in like questions of the closet and who's, like, it's actually quite simple to me that it's like, it's just a willingness to be seen as gay, like a tolerance of that publicly. And it's a decision you make without any real awareness of how that's going to play out in your life. I mean, for better or for worse. But, you know, there's a gulf of dark water between, you know, coming out and the self-love that's required to survive in the world, and, you know, and to kind of thrive, so to speak, you know, as a queer person in the world. And so, I don't know, I feel like that's something that I personally struggled with and wanted to put in the book. And I just remember, you know, when I finally, it was like 5 years, maybe more than that, after coming out, and I finally found like good gay friends, like good people, like secure in themselves, like happy. It wasn't like, you know, friends with like all rotted people or anything, but like, you know, just finding that group, and just how much laughter there was over the things that we had been ashamed of, and how much of a release that was. And so I think I was, you know, it's so funny, I'm contradicting myself now. Earlier I said, you know, I don't know if I write with that much awareness of how humor functions in the work. But I think actually in a way, maybe I was, because that, I remember what that laughter meant to me. And these men are so deep down in it, that, you know, the release, the acknowledgement of some truth, which usually comes through, you know, some irony or sarcasm, which is like, as, you know, as deep as they're willing to go in that acknowledgement. Yeah, that was necessary, and provides some kind of calibration for where they are.
I like the idea of the humor being a way and the laughter being a way to implicate the reader, because you can't control it, right? When you're reading something or you see something and it's funny, you just burst out laughing, and then, you know, we kind of like, oh my God, I shouldn't have laughed at that, but there you are. And, you know, and so it's a moment where the reader is incredibly vulnerable and honest, whether they want to be or not. And it's you know, it's usually a private moment because nobody knows what you're laughing at. But then, you know, hopefully they'll interrogate that a little bit if it's one of those things where you ask yourself, like, should I or should I have not laughed? But I did laugh, you know, and that's irrefutable. And so I really like that idea of the implication of the laughter.
Absolutely. I can't agree more with how vulnerable you are when you laugh. And I think that, so you're vulnerable, so it's an intimate moment. And I think that's why in my own life, I'm closest with people with whom I can laugh, with whom we have these shared moments of that kind of vulnerability. And it puts me at ease. It's not always easy to feel at ease in this world. And so if you can laugh with someone, it makes things better. It helps you escape either the momentary or the permanent situation that can be a real drag. And so absolutely that, and it's interesting too, and I'll bet you all have gone through this too, or had this consideration. When you read something in public, when we were all still allowed to read in public, and you're reading a funny piece and you hear that laughter, that's the only time you can hear an audience's reaction. And so you're with each other in the moment. You can track that, as opposed to friends I have who are like, oh, I read this, I hate reading serious pieces because they always land so flatly. And it's like, no, it's just that you can't hear people thinking. You can't hear people changing and being so, unless they're openly crying, which certainly can happen too, you can't hear someone hear that thing that changes how they feel. So reading a humorous piece gives you that beautiful, that sound that makes you think, okay, we're really here in this moment. We are present here.
Well, even though there are only 5 of us here right now in this digital world, Marie-Helene, would you want to read to us a little bit from Parakeet? Yeah.
Sure, and again, I don't think Parakeet is my funniest book, but talking about upending expectations, I'm just going to read a little. The grandmother there are many monologues in the book. The grandmother has a very, very long monologue. I'm just going to read a tiny paragraph from that. And now just imagine a bird, a tiny parakeet. It's her grandmother, but she comes to her as a tiny little cute bird. Just imagine that parakeet yelling all of this at a bride. Let's get back to the main event, me, and how I didn't use my body enough. Those of us with able bodies have a responsibility to use them as much as we can. Given another chance, you wouldn't believe how much I'd use it. Threesomes, foursomes, moresomes. Smoking is a joy of life. Good Lord, why did I ever give it up? My teachers called me disruptive. I should have disrupted more. In 1975, the most stunning man I'd seen up close approached me at a convenience store and asked if I'd go to his hotel room to make love. I'm holding a soup can and a bag of oranges, and I am not a woman men cross streets for. I say no because I was married. What a waste of a waistline. What a disappointment life is most of the time. Divinity opened itself up to me in aisle 4, and I said, nah, I'll just be taking these oranges. If it came around again, boy, I'd meet it. And I'd smoke like a house on fire. Disrupt. Disrupt. What fucking else are we here for?
I love that. Oh, I miss readings with rooms full of people. Yeah, I bet we all do. I want to give Sarah also a chance to read a bit, if you have, because I see I'm getting the 5-minute mark, and I want you all just to have an opportunity. So Sarah, do you want to read a little bit from True Love?
Sure. So Nina, my narrator, has gone to her new boyfriend Seth's house to be drawn in the nude. Seth is an artist, and she's given him her novel to read, her novel in progress. When I returned to model for Seth in the nude, I was surprised to find that our high school art teacher was there in his studio drinking wine. The stone roses were playing in the room's half darkness. I sat next to Mr. Crook, a clean, gentle gay man. We were silent, as if bewitched by the presence of Seth, a sort of modern oracle. I hear you're a novelist now, Mr. Crook whispered. I couldn't tell if he was amused. His eyes were fixed on the development of Seth's abstract masterpiece. That's my book, I said, gesturing to the orange envelope unopened on the floor near a stack of art forum. Extraordinary. Seth, what can you tell me about this future bestseller, he said. Nothing, said Seth. I haven't read it. You'll have to fill him in once you do, I said. He looked at me, then turned back around and continued painting. I'm not sure I can give you a proper critique, Nina, he said. I would like your permission to pass it on to my friend Jared. He's a student of literature. Yes, a wonderful idea, said Mr. Kruk. You know him? I said. Oh, yes, he was your classmate. They all went to high school together. Seth washed his paintbrush and laid it on a towel. He selected a pencil from a box of drawing supplies and scribbled on the back of an old receipt. This will depend on his other commitments, he said, but here's his number. I'll tell you when to text him if he agrees. He prefers to text. When Mr. Kruk left, Seth resumed explicating his work in progress. I feel that negative space and form play important recent roles. I transmute proportions of negative space onto dissimilar arbitrary portions of canvas. Thereby, I explore space in painting, in particular, the oppositional forces caught in the openness of absence. I lingered. He disappeared into the bathroom adjacent to his bedroom, and I heard him brushing his teeth. He emerged in his boxers wearing glasses as if ready for bed. So, when do you want to start? I said. He squinted. The modeling? Oh, I'm sorry. I don't have time tonight. I see. The demands of my time are immense, Nina. The real world steals my sanity. Here I am, constantly surveilled and manipulated by technology, reality, and advertising alike pissing in my face. You understand. I, too, often felt attacked, put upon, pushed around. I couldn't help but feel as if only I could love Seth enough for him to be fully open, and that only he could lend me the recognition I so needed. Falling in love with Seth was a way of falling in love with myself.
Wonderful. So either Deesha or Peter, would you like to read a little bit? It's totally fine if you don't want to or don't have a piece chosen, but I just wanted to give you the opportunity.
I'm going to pass. Thank you for reading earlier.
Of course, my pleasure.
I have a very short section I can read from the title story, which is about this man who lies, surprise, about this friend whose history he begins to bend, to his own ends, and the narrator's boyfriend learns that, he's sort of made some other things up and demands to meet this friend who has sort of been interjected into certain, histories and explanations. So anyway, the story is, casting and meeting this fake friend. And then at the end of it, there's a moment between the narrator and this actor, the guy who's played his friend sort of on the spot. And the fake friend's name is Finn, and obviously the narrator's the narrator. Put it under your rolls. Finn, I told him. I turned away and picked lint off my coat. The crowd was clearing, and I imagined Luke outside the shop waiting for me, walking away with him, driving until the skyscrapers shrunk into a thin smog in the rear view, and the mountains rose on the horizon, snow falling over the hills. I imagined falling asleep next to him, my chin against the back of his neck, his pulse on my jaw. I looked back for a moment and adjusted my collar. But don't make it seem like some big part, I said, smiling, like Romeo. Finn was right there almost, just for a moment. He looked at me as if I had a generous bone in my body, like I wasn't just trying to save my own skin. Maybe more of an Iago, he said. Exactly, I said, pretending I knew who that was.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Marie-Helene. Thank you, Deesha. Thank you, Sarah. Everyone tuning in, please remember that you can order all of their wonderful books in the link below. And if you're feeling generous, please consider making a donation to the Brooklyn Book Festival, which is celebrating its 15th year of presenting free literary programming. And with that, we'll wish you a good day or a good night, depending on when you're watching.
Thanks, Kendall.
Thank you, Kendall.
Thank you.
Thanks all.